The cold emptiness of space stretched on forever, but for the crew of the Defender, there was no time to enjoy the view. Captain Eli O'Connor stood at the front of the bridge, staring out at the vast, black void. Earth was no longer visible, just a small dot in the distance, an afterthought to the war that had ravaged it. The Kornath fleet was coming. This was it, the last stand. Eli had been a soldier for most of his life. He had fought in countless battles, but none had felt like this. The last remaining human forces were gathered here, all aboard a small fleet of ships, each one worn down by years of endless war. The Kornath were ruthless, strong, advanced, and relentless. They had taken everything from humanity. Cities were destroyed, whole continents lost. The war had seemed like a battle humanity could never win. Captain, the Kornath fleet is on the move, the communications officer, Lieutenant Rachel Kim, reported. Her voice was steady, but Eli could hear the fear in her tone. She had seen the devastation the Kornath caused, just like everyone else. Eli nodded grimly. All ships, prepare for battle. This is the last chance we have to save Earth. If we fail, this is the end of humanity. His words hung in the air like a heavy weight, but there was no time to dwell on them. The fate of humanity depended on this fight. But Eli couldn't help but think, was there any hope left? Had they already lost too much? The Kornath had crushed Earth's military forces, decimated the population, and left nothing but ruins in their wake. Captain, Rachel said again, her voice barely above a whisper, the enemy is closing in. They'll be here in less than an hour. Eli's mind raced. The Defender wasn't equipped to take on a full fleet of Kornath warships. The Terran Alliance had only managed to scrape together a few ships after the last attack, and even those were badly damaged. He glanced over at the tactical display, seeing the Kornath ships growing larger as they approached. They were like shadows in the dark, menacing and unstoppable. Status report on the fleet, Eli ordered. 5 ships left. Lieutenant Carlos Herrera, the tactical officer, replied. The rest were destroyed in the last wave. We have Defender, Vanguard, Sentinel, Thunderbolt, and Liberty. All damage. Shields at 30%. Eli clenched his jaw. The odds were against them. The Kornath had hundreds of ships, each one larger and more powerful than any of their own. Yet here they were, still standing. We may not have much, but we still have each other, Eli said, trying to inspire confidence in his crew. We hold the line. Earth's last hope is right here. A last prayer. As the final battle neared, Eli found himself standing alone in the small chapel aboard the Defender. It wasn't much, just a small room with a few benches and a flickering candle. But for him, it was the last place of peace in a galaxy on fire. He had never been much of a religious man, but in moments like this, when the weight of humanity's survival rested on his shoulders, he couldn't help but pray. His thoughts turned to his family, his wife, Maya, and their son, Liam. He hadn't seen them in years. They were far away, hidden in a shelter under the last remaining government protection on Earth. He wondered if they were alive, or if they had fallen victim to the Kornath's brutal onslaught. He clasped his hands together, closing his eyes. Please, he whispered, if there's any hope left in the universe, give it to us. I don't want to fail them. I don't want to fail humanity. He stood there for a moment, but the quiet was soon shattered by the sound of the ship's alarms. The Kornath had arrived. The final stand. Back on the bridge, the crew was in full battle mode. The tension was thick. Eli could see it on their faces, the fear, the uncertainty. But he also saw determination. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future of Earth, the future of their families, the future of everything they loved. Enemy ships are entering firing range, Carlos called out. Shields at 25%. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. Hold steady. We can do this. We will do this. Focus on their flagship. If we can take that down, we can disrupt their entire fleet. The crew nodded in unison. They had no choice but to fight with everything they had. Outside, the Kornath ships loomed closer, their dark silhouettes blocking out the stars. The Defender and the rest of the fleet powered up their weapons, the hum of the engines vibrating through the deck. Eli felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the countdown to battle began. "Weapons are locked," Rachel said. "Ready on your command, Captain." Eli took a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back. They would either win and save what was left of Earth, or they would be destroyed in the blink of an eye. "Fire," he commanded. The first strike. The Defender and the other ships launched everything they had, sending volleys of plasma and missiles toward the advancing Kornath fleet. The sky above was filled with flashes of bright light as the ships engaged in a brutal battle. For a brief moment, it felt like they might actually have a chance. The Kornath flagship took several hits, and their fleet seemed to hesitate, giving the humans a moment to strike. But the Kornath were swift. They adapted, countering each of humanity's moves with terrifying precision. One by one, the human ships were being destroyed. The Sentinel was hit hard, losing power and drifting into the darkness, a fireball in the distance. "We can't keep this up," Rachel shouted, her voice full of panic. "Our shields won't last." Eli's eyes burned with determination. "We will keep this up. We are humanity's last hope. If we fall, so does everything." The enemy fleet closed in, their weapons charging for the final strike. Eli knew this battle was far from over. But in this moment, he also knew one thing. They had not given up. They might be outmatched, outnumbered, and outgunned, but they would fight until the end. The Defender shuddered as another blast from the Kornath flagship hit its hull. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the emergency lights flickered on. The entire ship groaned under the strain. Eli gripped the armrest of his command chair, eyes locked on the view screen as enemy ships closed in. "Shields are at 10%, Captain," Lieutenant Rachel Kim called out, her voice tight with anxiety. "We won't last much longer at this rate." Eli's heart raced. He knew the situation was dire. The rest of the fleet wasn't doing much better. The Sentinel had been destroyed. The Vanguard was burning from the inside out, and the Thunderbolt was barely holding on. Only the Liberty and the Defender remained, but their shields were weakening fast. He took a deep breath. "Hold steady, everyone. We need to break through their lines. If we can take out their flagship, the rest of the fleet will fall apart." But even as he spoke, Eli could see the Kornath ships closing in faster, their weapons charging for another strike. The Defender was surrounded. The Kornath had them right where they wanted them. A flicker of hope. Then, just as the Defender braced for the next attack, the unexpected happened. A sudden flash of light appeared in the distance, brighter than the stars, followed by a thunderous boom that shook the Defender to its core. For a moment, Eli thought it was another massive Kornath weapon, but when the smoke cleared, what he saw made his heart skip a beat. "Captain, look!" Carlos, the tactical officer, shouted. His hands flew over the controls, trying to make sense of what was happening. On the view screen, a fleet of ships, strange and sleek, unlike anything humanity had ever seen, had appeared. They moved with astonishing speed, cutting through the Kornath lines with precision. Their weapons were powerful, yet controlled. Each shot they fired tore through the Kornath warships like paper, and the alien fleet began to falter, their movements becoming erratic. Eli's mind raced. Who were they? Could they be allies? Or was this just another trick to toy with humanity? "Captain, they're not Kornath," Rachel said, her voice filled with disbelief. They're human." Eli's eyes widened. "What?" The arrival of the Exodus fleet. The new ships surged forward, cutting through the Kornath fleet as if they had been waiting for this very moment. A massive flagship, gleaming with blue and silver light, emerged at the center of the formation. It was unlike any Earth ship Eli had ever seen. The Exodus, its name was visible on the hull as it barreled through the chaos. "This is the Exodus, Earth Fleet." A voice crackled through the communications channel. It was deep and calm, with a powerful authority behind it. "We've arrived to assist you. You're not alone." Eli's breath caught in his throat. His mind was spinning. "How? Where did you come from?" The voice on the other end didn't pause. "We've been monitoring the situation. Humanity's courage hasn't gone unnoticed. We've been preparing for this day. Now, we fight together." The ship's weapons powered up and fired, adding to the devastation against the Kornath. For the first time in months, Eli allowed himself to believe in a shred of hope. "Hold on, everyone." He called out to the crew. "We've got help. Stay focused. We can win this." The shift in power, the sudden appearance of the Exodus fleet threw the Kornath into disarray. They had expected a quick victory, but now they were being pushed back. Their lines were breaking, and their flagship, the Vortex, began to retreat. It had been their most powerful weapon, but now it was vulnerable. Eli could hardly believe it. The battle that had seemed hopeless just moments ago was now shifting in their favor. "Target the Vortex," Eli shouted. "If we can take down their flagship, they'll have no chance." The Defender and the remaining human ships, now reinforced by the Exodus fleet, surged forward, firing everything they had at the Kornath flagship. The Vortex's shields flickered, but it held for a moment longer. The Kornath were not going down without a fight. Rachel looked up from her console. "Captain, incoming strike from the Vortex. It's charging its main cannon." The Vortex's massive weapon glowed, a beam of concentrated energy building up for a devastating strike. Eli's mind raced. "We can't let it fire. Full speed ahead, all ships." The Defender shot forward, dodging incoming fire. The Exodus was close behind, its weapons hammering into the Vortex's shields. Eli could see the intensity in the Kornath commander's eyes on the view screen. The Kornath were desperate now. "Prepare to fire," Eli said, voice steady but his mind focused like never before. He wasn't about to let Earth's last hope slip away. The final countdown. The Defender reached the Vortex, its weapons blasting at the flagship's shields, while the Exodus continued its bombardment. The Vortex retaliated, unleashing a powerful burst of energy from its cannon, just as the Defender launched its final strike. Boom! The explosion rocked space. For a moment, everything went silent. The explosion in the void of space had been deafening. The Vortex, Kornath's flagship, was left scorched and battered, its once imposing hull now a twisted mess of burning wreckage. Eli O'Connor allowed himself a brief moment of triumph. The Vortex was down, its shields shattered, its weapons silenced. For a moment, they had won. But that moment was fleeting. "Captain," Rachel Kim's voice was filled with panic. "There's something's happening on the Vortex. It's not over." Eli's eyes locked on the view screen, and his stomach sank. The wreckage of the Vortex seemed to pulse with a strange, sickly light. A low hum filled the bridge, as if the entire ship was coming to life again. But this time, something was wrong. "What's happening?" Eli demanded. Carlos Herrera's hands flew over his controls. "I don't know, Captain, but I'm reading a massive energy surge coming from the wreckage. It's not from their normal weapons. This is different. It's something new." The Kornath's last gambit. A crackling voice echoed through the comms, and for the first time, it was not the voice of the Kornath's leader, but someone far more sinister. It was cold, mechanical, and full of malice. "This is the last warning, humans. You have no idea what you're up against." Eli's eyes narrowed. That wasn't the Kornath commander. That voice was artificial, robotic even. Suddenly, the wreckage of the Vortex shifted, and from its shattered remains, a new weapon emerged. It was enormous, a massive orb of black, crackling energy, surrounded by swirling energy fields and metallic tendrils. It was unlike anything the humans had ever seen. "What the hell is that?" Rachel whispered. "Prepare for incoming fire," Eli barked, realizing what was happening. get out of range. Now. But it was too late. The weapon fired, unleashing a devastating beam of energy that ripped through space at unimaginable speeds. The Defender and the Exodus barely had time to react. The beam slammed into the Defender, sending shockwaves through the ship. Eli was thrown forward, his body slamming into the control panel. Shields failing. Carlos shouted, his voice filled with alarm. Powering down. We're losing propulsion, Rachel added, struggling to keep the ship under control. Outside, the blast continued. The Vortex's weapon had pierced the Defender's defenses, and the ship was now drifting helplessly in space. Desperation in the void. Eli pushed himself up from the floor, his vision blurry from the impact. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, but he ignored it. The Defender was still intact for now, but how long would that last? The new weapon was unlike anything they had prepared for. It was too powerful. We're being targeted, Carlos yelled. They're locking onto the Exodus now. Not if I can help it, Eli muttered under his breath. Rachel, bring us back online. I need the engines running. Now. Rachel worked feverishly at her console, her face pale but determined. I'm trying. The power surge knocked out half our systems. We'll have to reroute auxiliary power. The battle outside the ship was chaos. The Kornath's new weapon had turned the tide. The Exodus, Earth's last hope, was now under direct fire from the mysterious superweapon. The powerful ship was fighting back, but its shields were weakening, and the rest of the human fleet was scattered, taking heavy fire from the Kornath's reinforcements. Captain, Rachel said, her voice steady despite the panic that gripped her. If we don't disable that weapon now, we're done. We have to take out the Vortex's core. It's the only way. Eli turned to her, his face grim. I know, but we can't get close enough. Their weapon will tear us apart. Carlos interrupted. There's a way, Captain. If we can get into the Vortex's gravity well, we could launch a boarding operation. We send a small team in, get to the core, and shut it down. Eli's mind raced. A boarding operation. The thought was terrifying. The Defender was barely holding together. A small team against a super weapon in the heart of an enemy ship. But they had no choice. All right, Eli said, voice hard. Rachel, get us into position. Carlos, get me a list of volunteers. We're going in. A risk like no other. Minutes felt like hours as the Defender drifted closer to the Vortex, using what little power it had left to maneuver through the wreckage of the battlefield. The Kornath weapon continued to fire, blasting into the Exodus and the other remaining ships. It was chaos, a battle between life and death, and humanity was hanging on by a thread. Eli's hands clenched into fists. He knew this would be the most dangerous mission they had ever attempted. If they failed, the Kornath would finish what they started. Earth would fall, and the war would end in destruction. Captain, Carlos said quietly, we've got a small team ready. It's going to be a suicide mission, but they're prepared. They know what's at stake. Elid's heart pounded. He glanced over at the team members standing ready. Lieutenant Kim, Sergeant Porter, and several of the bravest soldiers from the fleet. They were ready to give their lives for Earth. The weight of that decision crushed Eli, but there was no choice. This was their only shot. All right, Eli said, his voice steady, despite the turmoil inside him. We move fast. We move smart. Get to the core, destroy the weapon, and get out. No heroics. We do this as a team, or we don't do it at all. The Boarder's mission. The Defender slowly approached the Vortex, now dangerously close to the superweapon's core. A small team of soldiers, armed to the teeth, boarded a small shuttle, preparing to make the most daring move of their lives. Good luck, Rachel said quietly as the shuttle doors close. May Earth have mercy on us. The shuttle raced through the vast expanse of wreckage, dodging debris as it cut through the battle-scarred space around the Vortex. Inside, the small team of soldiers, led by Sergeant Porter, was bracing themselves for what was to come. They were armed, ready, and filled with a grim determination. This was humanity's last chance. Sergeant Porter's eyes flicked over his team. Lieutenant Kim, the sharp-eyed officer who had never hesitated in a fight. Private Mark, a young soldier who had joined the fleet just months before. And Corporal Vasquez, the veteran, his face hard and eyes focused. Together, they were the team chosen for this mission, and though they had no illusions about the risks, they knew that they had one goal: to shut down the Kornath superweapon that threatened to destroy Earth. "Stay sharp," Porter's voice echoed in the tight cabin of the shuttle. "We're heading straight into their heart. Once we land, we move fast. We don't have much time." Rachel Kim gave him a sharp nod. She was always the calm one, but even she was visibly tense. "We're almost there, Sergeant. The vortex is right ahead. We're in range of their gravity well." Porter glanced out of the small window. The massive vortex loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and menacing against the backdrop of space. The superweapon, the core of oblivion, was nestled deep inside, surrounded by layers of Kornath defenses. Porter's voice was steady, but there was a flicker of uncertainty behind his words. "If we can't get close enough, we'll never make it inside. We're going to have to board directly through the hangar bay. We'll be exposed." "Exposed is better than dead," Vasquez muttered, checking his weapon. "And I'd rather be fighting on the inside than waiting to get shot at out here." A dangerous landing. The shuttle's thrusters roared as it entered the vortex's gravity well, and the small vessel was quickly pulled toward the massive ship. The view through the shuttle's window shifted, revealing the massive vortex in all its terrifying scale. It was a war machine, built for destruction, but there was something different about it now, something new. A strange energy pulsed from deep within the ship, a dark glow that seemed to reach into the very heart of space itself. "We're coming in too fast," Mark called out from the rear of the shuttle, his voice laced with panic. Rachel Kim quickly adjusted the controls, slowing their descent. "I've got it. Hold on." With a gut-wrenching jolt, the shuttle touched down on the vortex, the landing gear screeching against the metal surface. The shuttle's exterior was battered, and the team inside was shaken. But they were still alive. "Move, move, move," Porter barked. The shuttle doors slammed open, and the team rushed out onto the dark, metallic floors of the vortex's hangar. The air inside was thick with the smell of burning metal, and the entire ship seemed to hum with a low, ominous power. They could feel it in the air, the pulse of the superweapon, growing stronger. Eli had been right. The core of oblivion was somewhere inside this ship, and they had no idea what it could do when fully activated. They had to stop it before it was too late. Kornath resistance. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hangar as the team moved forward, weapons drawn. They had prepared for this moment, but nothing could prepare them for the sight that awaited them. "Clear left," Porter shouted, signaling for the team to split up. The hangar was massive, and though it was quiet, the soldiers could feel the weight of something watching them, waiting. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the loud crackle of enemy fire. "Ambush," Vasquez yelled as they dove for cover behind crates and machinery. Out of the shadows, Kornath soldiers, horrific, hulking creatures, emerged. Their alien armor glinted in the dim light, and their weapons crackled with deadly energy. They had been waiting for this moment. Porter reacted instinctively. "Take them out," he ordered. The team fired back, their weapons tearing through the air with precision. Each shot struck a Kornath soldier, but more kept coming. They were relentless, pouring out of hidden alcoves and tunnels, their movements coordinated, like they had been expecting this attack. "We need to move," Rachel shouted. "We're not going to win this fight unless we get to the core." "Keep them busy," Porter ordered. "Mark, Kim, go left. Vasquez and I will cover the right." The battle was fierce. The human soldiers held their ground, but every step forward was met with another wave of Kornath resistance. The hangar was a maze of steel and shadows, and the Kornath knew it better than the humans did. But the soldiers pushed forward, using every advantage they could find. Rachel and Mark were the first to break through, sprinting toward a narrow hallway that led deeper into the ship. But the Kornath were close behind, their growls filling the air as they fired at the humans. "We need to make it to the core," Rachel yelled, determination in her eyes. Porter and Vasquez were right behind them, cutting through the enemy with precision. "This way," Porter shouted, pointing to a massive door ahead. "That's our way in." But as they ran toward the door, it slammed shut with a loud metallic clang. The core of oblivion was just on the other side, but they were trapped. The only way to reach the core now was to bypass the defenses, the last line of protection. "Damn it," Porter growled, slamming his fist into the door. "It's locked down tight." The room was a furnace, the air thick with tension and the electric hum of the core of oblivion that pulsed at the center like a beating heart of destruction. Sergeant Porter and his team had set the charges around the core, but even as they worked, the entire ship seemed to be coming alive, as if it knew they were there to stop it. "Charges are set," Private Mark called out, his voice strained as he worked to secure the last explosive. "But we're gonna need a damn miracle to get out of here in time." Porter didn't answer. He knew it was true. The vortex was far more than just a ship. It was a weapon, a living nightmare that could tear apart an entire fleet in seconds. The core of oblivion was designed to destroy whole worlds, and they were standing on the precipice of disaster. "Rachel, how much time do we have left?" Porter barked, turning to Lieutenant Kim as she checked her watch. 30 minutes, she replied, but there was no relief in her voice. "And the core is destabilizing faster than we expected. It could blow any second. We need to move now." But as the team turned to head back toward the exit, they heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and full of intent. Kornath reinforcements. "Damn it," Vasquez cursed under his breath, checking his weapon. "We're surrounded." A loud metallic door slammed shut behind them, and the vortex's eerie hum grew louder, vibrating in the walls. The way out was blocked. "Everyone, take cover," Porter shouted, his mind working in overdrive. "We're not going out without a fight." A deadly standoff. The Kornath soldiers appeared at the far end of the room, their armored figures moving with practiced precision, their weapons gleaming menacingly in the low light. They had the advantage of numbers. But the humans had the determination. Both sides were caught in a deadly standoff, locked in a waiting game where any misstep could mean death. Porter crouched low, signaling for his team to scatter. "We hold them off. Rachel, Mark, get to that door. We're getting out of here." But even as he gave the order, he knew that it wasn't going to be easy. The Kornath were too strong. They had too much firepower, and the ship's security systems were on high alert. They were on a ticking clock, and the chances of getting out of there alive were slim. The Kornath opened fire. A war of attrition. The room erupted into chaos. Gunfire ricocheted off the walls, and explosions shook the ground beneath them. The vortex groaned as though it were alive, the entire ship seemingly reacting to the violence below. Porter fired back, his shots precise but futile in the face of the overwhelming force. Lieutenant Kim darted across the room, using her agility to keep herself out of the line of fire. Private Mark and Corporal Vasquez provided cover, their weapons blasting away at the advancing Kornath soldiers. But the Kornath didn't stop. They advanced, slowly but steadily, their numbers overwhelming. The human team was running out of time, running out of ammo, and running out of space to maneuver. Porter's heart pounded as he realized the grim truth. They couldn't hold them off much longer. The core of oblivion was destabilizing, and if they didn't make it out in time, the entire vortex would be obliterated. But if they didn't stop the Kornath, they wouldn't have time to escape at all. "We need to move now," Porter shouted. The final push. The team regrouped, retreating slowly toward the back of the room, inching closer to the exit, but they were too slow. The Kornath had closed in, and the hallway they had entered from was now a death trap. "I've got an idea," Rachel Kim said, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "We can overload the ship's power core. It's a one-way ticket, but it'll buy us enough time to escape before the core blows." Porter's mind raced. The vortex's power core was massive. If they overloaded it, the blast would send a shockwave throughout the ship. It would buy them time to escape, but it could also destroy everything in its path, including them. "That's our only option," Porter said. "Let's do it." Rachel moved quickly, pulling up the emergency override codes on her console. "It'll take a minute to hack into the system. We're going to need cover." The team split up, laying down heavy fire as they tried to hold off the Kornath soldiers. Their guns roared, but it was clear they were running low on ammunition. With every second that passed, the Kornath got closer. The core's pulse was growing stronger. They didn't have much time. The ticking clock. 30 seconds, Rachel shouted as she furiously typed into the control panel, trying to break through the ship's security. "We're almost there," Mark said through gritted teeth, his gun steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But then, a massive Kornath commander appeared, cutting through the human lines with terrifying efficiency. This wasn't just any soldier. It was a battle-hardened leader, wearing a towering suit of black and red armor. Its eyes gleamed with malice as it locked onto Porter. "Move," Porter shouted, pushing Rachel toward the control panel. He took a step forward, meeting the commander's fierce gaze, weapon in hand. The two forces collided. A desperate gamble. Porter fought with every ounce of strength he had, but the Kornath commander was too strong. Their weapons clashed, and Porter was sent reeling by a brutal blow. Mark and Vasquez tried to help, but the Kornath were relentless, each one more terrifying than the last. 15 seconds. Rachel cried out, "Hurry." Porter had to end this. Now. With a final, desperate lunge, Porter slammed his weapon into the commander's armor, triggering a feedback loop that caused the Kornath soldier to stumble. In a blur of motion, Vasquez tossed a grenade at the commander's feet, and the explosion sent shockwaves through the room. "Now," Porter shouted as he staggered back to Rachel. "Go, go, go." The vortex groaned like a dying beast. Inside the heart of the ship, the core of oblivion pulsed with an unnatural, menacing rhythm. It was a countdown, a ticking time bomb set to consume everything in its path. 30 seconds. That was all they had left. The team was scattered, moving in a chaotic blur of motion as the Kornath closed in. The explosion had taken out a few of them, but the Kornath commander, the towering armored figure, was still standing. His face twisted with fury as he advanced toward Sergeant Porter and his team. "Go," Porter shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The countdown was ticking faster, louder now, drowning out everything else. Rachel Kim was already several paces ahead, frantically typing at the control panel to release the emergency doors. "I'm almost there," she yelled, her hands flying over the keys. But the Kornath commander was relentless. He barreled forward with the speed and power of a charging bull, slamming into Private Mark, who was trying to cover their retreat. Mark's body was thrown across the room like a ragdoll, crashing into the walls with a sickening thud. "Mark!" Rachel screamed, turning to look, but she didn't stop typing. "Focus!" Porter barked, his eyes locking onto the Kornath commander, who now turned his wrath toward Rachel. The massive alien lifted its weapon, its energy blade crackling menacingly as it took a step toward her. "No!" Porter roared, rushing forward. He raised his own weapon, firing a burst of rounds at the commander, but the Kornath leader barely flinched. The energy blade hummed in the air, ready to strike. The ultimate sacrifice. Everything slowed down for Porter. His pulse thundered in his ears as he realized how close they were to losing everything. He had one choice. The only choice. He sprinted toward the commander, throwing himself between Rachel and the oncoming blade. The energy weapon swung down in a flash of light, and Porter felt the searing heat as it tore through his armor. He screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. With everything he had left, Porter slammed his shoulder into the commander, sending the hulking figure staggering back just enough to give Rachel the time she needed. "Go. Now," Porter shouted. Rachel Kim, her face pale with fear, hesitated for a split second. But she knew. The explosion would come soon, and there was no time to wait. With a swift motion, she typed in the final sequence. The massive doors in front of them slid open with a groan, revealing a narrow corridor leading toward the escape route. "Move," she yelled, grabbing Porter and pulling him toward the door. The escape. The team scrambled to their feet, moving as fast as they could, leaving the commander stunned for just a moment. Vasquez helped Mark, who was barely conscious, limp toward the door. But the Kornath leader wasn't done. He shook off the hit and charged again. "Get down," Vasquez yelled, pulling Rachel and Mark into the corridor as the Kornath commander's weapon sliced through the air once more. The door slammed shut behind them, but the rumble of the ship told them it was far from over. Porter's hand was on his side, where the energy blade had cut deep. His blood soaked through his uniform, but he didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead. The countdown was still ticking. They had seconds, maybe a minute. "Move faster," Porter urged, his voice gritting with pain. The corridor felt endless, stretching further and further with each step. The hum of the vortex seemed to grow louder, the walls shaking with each new pulse from the core. It was coming. 10 seconds. Rachel shouted, her voice panicked. She looked back toward the core, then toward the way ahead. They couldn't outrun it. The final moment. The escape pods were just ahead. Porter's legs were like lead, but he pushed himself forward, ignoring the agony in his side. Mark was still conscious, but barely standing. Vasquez had the rear, making sure no Kornath soldiers had followed them. They were almost there. The door to the escape pod bay hissed open, and they rushed inside. The pods were ready, the countdown on the main screen flashing, but the team knew they wouldn't make it out unless they got in now. "Get in," Porter shouted, shoving Mark toward the nearest pod. Rachel was already in one of the pods, pulling the lever to release the hatch. She was about to seal it when she saw the Kornath commander charging down the hallway behind them. "No," Porter screamed, diving toward the pod. He reached the console, just as the door to the pod slammed shut. He smashed his hand against the panel, and the pod shot into space, but not before a shot rang out. The Kornath commander had fired. A shocking twist. The escape pod shuddered, and Porter felt the sickening jolt of the impact. The Kornath's weapon had hit one of the pods, Vasquez's pod, the last one to launch. There was no way to know whether Vasquez had made it out. Inside their own pod, Rachel, Mark, and Porter stared at the monitor, watching as the vortex's final moments played out in front of them. The core of oblivion had reached its breaking point. The explosion was inevitable. But as the countdown hit 0, the vortex didn't just explode. A flash of light illuminated the space, followed by a massive shockwave that sent the escape pods careening in every direction. The last thing Porter saw before the screen went black was the vortex tearing itself apart, its once mighty frame crumbling into space debris. The void of space was silent, eerily so. The vortex had exploded in a brilliant flash, sending shockwaves through the surrounding system. The remaining escape pods drifted aimlessly, each one carrying the last survivors of humanity's desperate mission to stop the core of oblivion. Sergeant Porter awoke to the soft beeping of his pod's alarm. The jolt had thrown him unconscious for a few minutes, but now he was alone in the dark, floating through the wreckage. His side ached from the energy blade's wound, but there was no time for pain. He forced himself to sit up, wiping the blood from his face as he checked the pod systems. The screen flickered weakly, but the life support system was still online. "Status report," Porter muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. He was alone. The pod's monitor flickered again, and he caught a glimpse of his escape route. A swirling mass of debris and wreckage surrounded him. Pieces of the vortex drifted lazily through space, but there was no sign of the other pods. Vasquez. Where was he? The Kornath commander's final blast had hit Vasquez's pod, but it was unclear whether his pod had made it or not. Mark and Rachel were still alive, he hoped. They had to be. But the worry gnawed at him. They couldn't be lost now. Not after everything they'd been through. Porter gritted his teeth and tapped a few commands into the pod's console, sending out a distress signal. A long road ahead. Outside, the vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly. But in the darkness, there was a sliver of light, a faint beacon from another escape pod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Porter hope. Rachel, Mark, he muttered to himself, adjusting his course toward the signal. His pod's thrusters kicked on with a sputter, and the small craft began to move forward, creeping toward the distant light. Meanwhile, in another pod, Lieutenant Rachel Kim opened her eyes slowly, her body aching from the impact of the explosion. The pod's controls were flickering, but everything was still functioning. Her pod's hull was scared, but it had held together. "Mark," she said quietly, looking over at the other pod's seat. Private Mark was unconscious but breathing, his face pale and his body bruised. She couldn't leave him alone. Rachel gritted her teeth and unstrapped herself, reaching over to check his vitals. He was alive. Barely. "Hold on, Mark. We'll make it through this," she whispered to him, her fingers brushing his forehead. The pod's internal lighting flickered, showing her a broken, chaotic view of space outside. Debris from the vortex was everywhere. But there was one thing she was certain of. Humanity had done it. The core of oblivion had been destroyed. The Kornath weapon was no more. Now, they just had to survive the aftermath. A narrow escape. Porter's pod drifted closer to Rachel's beacon. The beacon was weak, just a flicker in the vastness of space, but it was a sign that they were still alive. His heart raced with relief. Suddenly, the pod's comm system crackled to life. "Porter, is that you?" Rachel's voice came through the static, weak but unmistakable. "Rachel," Porter said, relief flooding his chest. "Thank God. How's Mark?" "Not good," she replied. "He's unconscious, but he's alive. We need to get him to safety. Can you reach us?" "I'm almost there," Porter said, his fingers flying across the controls. "Hang on. We'll get you out." As his pod drifted closer, Porter could see Rachel's pod just ahead, half hidden in the shadow of a massive chunk of the vortex wreckage. The two pods were now only a few hundred meters apart. Porter pushed his pod forward with all the power it had left, the engines sputtering as they struggled to maintain the course. The wreckage of the vortex was everywhere, a huge, twisted metal carcass that seemed to stretch out infinitely. It was a graveyard for the brave souls who had fought to save humanity. Porter finally reached Rachel's pod, and he maneuvered his pod alongside hers. "Rachel, I'm coming in," Porter shouted through the comm. He activated the docking system, and with a soft thud, the pods connected. A new beginning. Porter pried open the hatch and pulled himself into Rachel's pod. His body felt like lead, but he pushed through the pain. "Mark's in bad shape," Rachel said, her voice tight with worry. "We need to get him back to Earth. Fast." "I'm on it," Porter said, carefully helping her lift Mark into a reclining position. "We've got one shot at this. The escape pod systems are too damaged to keep up with the fleet's signals. We need to make it to the nearest friendly station. They're our only hope." But even as they began their calculations for the long journey home, Porter's mind was still heavy with the uncertainty of it all. Vasquez was still out there, and they had no idea whether he had survived. The Kornath weren't gone, not entirely. The war was far from over. But as they set their course for the nearest station, a small glimmer of hope remained. The core of oblivion had been destroyed. They had stopped the Kornath's deadliest weapon. For the first time in years, Humanity had a chance to rebuild and prepare for whatever came next. As the pod drifted toward the edge of the wreckage, the stars beyond seemed brighter, just a little. It was a small victory in the grand war that still loomed ahead. But humanity had proven something important. No matter how hopeless things seemed, they would fight, and they would survive.